This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, we meet the director of the Norfolk Chamber Music Festival in its 76th year in collaboration with the Yale Summer School of Music. Melvin Chen will tell us about the history of chamber music in the northwest corner of the state, and he makes the case that classical music isn't dying.
Music is actually alive, it's still growing, and so part of that is also featuring in some way the music of young people.
You'll hear more from Melvin Chen later in the show. But first, debate around tax reform in the U.S. often pits the rich against the poor at a time when the gap between the two continues to widen dramatically. According to the Institute for Policy Studies, the 20th wealthiest people own more wealth than the bottom half of the American population combined. That's 152 million people. So what's the solution? Do you think the wealthy in America pay enough in taxes? Or are you one of the 1% that feels like you've paid enough back into society and don't want additional burdens? You can join the conversation, 860-275-7266. Email wherewelive at WNPR.org. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Now, Chuck Collins has an interesting perspective. He's a senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies based in Washington, D.C., co-editor of Inequality.org, and he's written several books. The one we're focusing on today is Born on Third Base. A one-percenter makes the case for tackling inequality, bringing wealth home, and committing to the common good. Chuck joins us from the studios of WGBH in Boston. Chuck, welcome to Where We Live.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for having me, Lucy.
Now, you've written several books, but for listeners who may not know about your work, they'd probably recognize the name of your great-grandfather, Oscar Mayer.
That's right. Yep. My dad used to say bringing home the bacon meant something different in our family, which is true. But yeah, I'm in fourth generation of a great, 1880s founded business.
Now, you've written a lot, you do a lot of speaking engagements, and you often say that you were born lucky. Tell people what you mean.
Well, I think, in my circumstances, I actually was, born into a family with substantial wealth. I actually, inherited enough wealth when I was 21 that I could pay off my college tuition and have a substantial amount of money left over. And I'm still unraveling all the ways in which that gave me a head start. Not just money, but sort of the social capital of growing up in an affluent family, 4 generations of economic stability, access to education, access to help when things go wrong. All those things kind of are, I think of them as almost like compounding advantages over generations.
When you were a child, did you understand that you had this privilege, that there were a lot of Americans who didn't have the lifestyle you had?
By coincidence, 50 years ago, this weekend is the anniversary of the Detroit riots, and I was 7 years old. And I think that was actually a kind of end of innocence moment for me because my mom explained to me that underlying those riots 50 years ago was that growing gap, the gap between city and suburb, rich and poor, black and white, and that sort of stuck with me. That was sort of a seed that made me feel like, oh, all is not well, and it has to do with inequality.
Now, when you were in your teens, you moved from Michigan to Worcester. What brought you there?
I was hungry for other life experiences. I really grew up in an affluent bubble of Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. I was the only person in my private boys' school, Cranbrook School, not to go right to college. That's the same high school that Mitt Romney went to. So I actually came to Worcester and I did an internship apprenticeship program, and I stayed another year just to work odd jobs. And it was just an opportunity for me to get out of that bubble and make friends and do other kinds of work and see the world from a different perspective.
Did you get the firsthand glimpse of true poverty, some of the people that you may have met in this working class town?
Yeah, actually in the late 70s, Worcester was definitely down on its luck. And a lot of the people I met were decent, hardworking people who just weren't able to get ahead. I worked with tenants in public housing communities. I worked as a teacher in a daycare center with kids that came from families that didn't have anywhere near the advantages I had. So all of that was part of the experience. And later I worked with, after college, I worked with mobile home park residents around New England, including in Connecticut, where the residents didn't own their land, didn't own their parks, and I was working with them to buy their parks and own them as a resident-owned cooperative. So again, I had this intimate front row seat to how people were sort of struggling with stagnant wages, where also coming from an affluent family, I could see how wealth was multiplying, wealth was creating more wealth at the top.
So you did something not just doing good in your 20s, but then you made a decision that might be surprising to some people listening in terms of the inheritance that you would have gotten from your family. What did you decide to do?
Well, I think I was inspired by authentic communities where people really kind of were all in for each other, and that was not something I grew up with. I mean, I grew up around people who were generous and charitable, but I didn't have the experience of solidarity and reciprocity that I was seeing. And so I made the decision to give the wealth away, not necessarily out of sort of just a charitable impulse, but it actually felt like it was interfering with my own progress in life as a person, So I made this decision to give the wealth I had away to several foundations in the region, and continued to do the work that I've been doing. But it did kind of liberate me in the sense of being able to look very unflinchingly at these inequalities that have emerged really in the last 30 years.
There are cases of the wealthy that are still able to, hold on to their wealth but still do good. But why did you take that step?
Well, I was 26 years old, so I look at my own children in their 20s and say, look, your brains are still developing. But I think in my case, I didn't want to be a philanthropist. I think that is, honorable work, but it wasn't what I felt called to do. I really wanted to make my own way, not defined by something that happened, 100 years ago. Now, in retrospect, that's impossible. But at the time, I thought maybe I could. And, I wanted to make my own way. And I some people say, well, yeah, if you'd held on to that money, you'd have a very large amount of money and you could be doing good with that. But I feel like I have plenty of opportunities to do good work.
This is Where We Live. We're talking with Chuck Collins, author of Born on Third Base, a one percenter makes the case for tackling inequality, bringing wealth home, and committing to the common good. He's joining us today from the studios of WGBH in Boston. Can I ask you, Chuck, what was your family's reaction when you decided to give away, again, your inheritance?
Well, I thanked my parents for the opportunities I'd had and tried to explain why I wanted to make this decision. And actually, my father came out to visit me in Massachusetts, and he asked some pretty good questions like, well, look, you're single. What if someday you have a family member that has an illness? What if you have a child and that child has a special need? Aren't you going to wish you had that money? To which I replied, well, if that were to happen, I'd be in the same boat as 99% of the people I know. I would have to get some help. And he said, well, then you would, but ultimately you'd have to fall back on government, and that would be a tattered, lousy safety net. And I said, well, maybe I'd have a personal stake in making that a better safety net. To which any smart parent replied, so idealistic. But in the end, I think that my family really understood. To tell you the truth, I had no idea the other mountain of advantages and privileges that I had. I'm white, I'm male, I have a debt-free college education, which, as we know today, is a privilege. Mm-hmm. I have all, this kind of sort of stability of growing up in a family. I learned about money. I mean, I have so much advantage wired into my life that I can't give away. It's just there. Mm. And so that's been part of the understanding. And I've come to appreciate, lots of people, both in my immediate family and extended family, who try to be very thoughtful about how they use wealth philanthropically and how to invest in a way that helps build a strong and resilient economy. So there's many, many paths. I don't think there's just one.
You write in your book that your father warned you about life being unpredictable, having a safety net, as you mentioned. And you learned fairly quickly after you gave away your family, your inheritance, that life does throw you some punches. What exactly happened to you?
Well, yeah, I think my father said to me things like, you grew up in a bubble and bad things can happen. And then, after I made this decision and signed the papers and transferred this wealth to several foundations, I lived in a house that burned down. Fortunately, no one was hurt. But I was very disoriented. I mean, I lost everything I had, including, all the papers that said who I was. So I sort of was just completely disoriented. And the day after this house fire happened, I'm sort of standing around looking at this charred out house, and up pull a carload of people that I had worked with down the road, a bunch of mobile home park residents who'd heard about the fire and came to help us put our lives back together. And in that moment, I kind of felt like, wow, I think I'm getting what I want, which is I want to live in a community where people show up for each other and help each other out. And so it was a kind of spiritual affirmation that maybe I'm going to be okay, even though it felt like I was taking a leap.
And that's a theme throughout your book, this idea that the 1% to 5%, the wealthiest Americans in this country, that they should be investing in their communities in ways instead of finding ways to avoid more taxes. But we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. But I wanted you, because you are considered the inequality expert, Chuck Collins, explain to us why the income inequality, how bad is it in this country if it doesn't improve, this gap is not lessened?
Well, I would characterize what we're living through as a period of extreme inequality, similar to what the United States went through 100 years ago, during the first Gilded Age, where we have a dizzying gap both in income and wealth and opportunity. And, for 40 years, real wages for the bottom half of wage earners have pretty much stayed stagnant or fallen. And meanwhile, most of the income and wealth gains have not just gone to the top 1%, but are kind of gushing up to the top 1/10 of 1%. So we're living in a period where wealth is very concentrated. And it actually matters a lot because it undermines sort of social cohesion. It obviously undermines democracy. I think the election that we just lived through is a reflection that a polarized economy gives rise to a polarized politics. Healthcare, it's bad for the economy. You can sort of, I've come to realize there's almost like a mountain of interdisciplinary research on why these inequalities undermine pretty much everything you and I care about. Mm-hmm. And so that's the moment we're in. And but I also think that moment creates an interesting thing, which is, for me, for people in my circumstances who grew up in the 1% or have made entrepreneurial wealth, it's actually entirely in our selfish interest to fix these inequalities because they undermine the quality of life for everyone, including the very wealthy.
Now, when you go around and talk about, I know as early as 2003, we learn in your book that you travel with some 1%ers, including the father of Bill Gates Sr. How are Americans responding to your message that it's up to the wealthy to return what society has enabled them to be successful?
I think people are obviously pretty polarized on that, and it sort of depends on the story that you have in your head about how wealth is created. So, I think the dominant story is, look, there's a successful group of people who get up early in the morning, work hard all day, take risks, and create enormous wealth. And they deserve it because it's a function of their own individual effort. And there are obviously cases where there are new immigrants who show up with very little in their pockets and make extraordinary heroic efforts to build companies and businesses. But the bigger story, I think, and it exists side by side with the other story, is no one does it alone. And if you have wealth of the 15 million or 15 billion level, your wealth in part comes from the function of the society, the things that we all do together, the public institutions, the investments, the research, the infrastructure, intellectual property protections. I mean, go down the list. There's a web of commonwealth that makes individual wealth possible. And what I find is that if people see that, whether they're wealthy or not, what I've found is like someone like Bill Gates' dad grew up, got the GI Bill, first person in his family to go to college, got the GI Bill to go to law school. He sees this like web of public investments that made his own wealth and success possible. And so he says, well, yeah, I worked hard, but I need to give back so that the next generation can have the same opportunities I had. And that creates a very different story. So part of the reason I wrote this book, Born on Third Base, is because I wanted people to understand there's a very different story about individual wealth and success and the role of society in making that possible. And part of that is through paying taxes. Part of it's by giving to charity. Part of it's by giving other gifts. But a big part of it is through public investments. And, we used to tax ourselves at much higher levels. And I think of after World War II, we taxed ourselves. High incomes and high estates and inheritances were taxed more, and funds went to pay for public goods like debt-free college education and first-time homebuyer loans and things that built mostly a white middle class. But that gives us an example, a clue of what good societies are capable of.
But let's talk about that a little bit more, because I'm sure you've heard from many, the entrepreneur that says, I am giving back because I'm creating jobs. I'm giving people jobs. I'm paying for their health care. Why isn't that enough?
Well, a lot of times if you kind of dig into the biographies of those entrepreneurs, you find, they got a publicly funded debt-free college education. They're operating in a field that was largely built through public investments, or they enjoy the benefits of publicly funded infrastructure. So yes, creating a business and employing people and paying a living wage is obviously a really important part of the equation. But after World War II, those 30 years after World War II, there's really no substitute for a robust, healthy, public-funded sector. It's not enough just to be an employer. And this is what I find. I love hearing stories of, how people have made it. But what's particularly beautiful are the people who see that they didn't do it alone, that they actually got a lot of help along the way, that it's not just sort of the great man theory of wealth creation. I was born in a state of nature. No one helped me. I started this company. Leave me alone. But quite the opposite. I was born into a society where I just landed on a society. The United States has this remarkable, 200 years of public investments, property rights protections, patents, publicly funded research and education. And if we start to disinvest that, which is basically what we're doing, if we start to withdraw tax dollars from that public sector, we will kill the goose that lays the golden egg. We will eat the seed corn of what a good society is possible.
At the same,
and so even wealthy people, there are even a lot of wealthy people who start to understand that. There's this guy, Peter Georgescu, who just wrote this book called Capitalists Arise, basically calling on his fellow CEOs to urgently step in and fix these inequality issues.
At the same time, you mentioned the 2016 election. I think at the end of this month, there's a deadline for the tax plan under President Trump's administration. He campaigned on cutting tax rates for businesses and corporations. He won. What does that say about the Americans who voted for him? And are they really tapped into this idea of income inequality in this country?
I think this election was about inequality. I think that when the economic gains of the last 40 years are not shared with half the population, that creates anger. It creates a sense of betrayal. I think my experience talking to Trump voters, which I do a lot of, is people are kind of all over the place in terms of why they voted for the president. But most people feel like, they feel overtaxed. And I do think that many low and middle income people in our country are overtaxed. And part of what we've done over the last 50 years is we've shifted the tax obligations off the wealthy, off of global transnational corporations, and we've shifted it onto low and middle income people and onto domestic and small businesses. So they're feeling the pressure, and then the anti-tax people kind of manipulate that. They say, well, we're going to give you a tax cut. And if you look at the tax cut that's been proposed, whether it's Paul Ryan's plan or the president's plan, there's going to be a little bit of tax cut for everybody. But my people, the people with incomes over, $5 million are going to it's going to be a money grab. I mean, it's a huge giveaway to the wealthiest groups and the largest global corporations. When we talk about corporate taxation, it's like, can you really do better than zero for a lot of these companies that have been paying zero or very little taxes? If we're going to reform the corporate tax system, we should do something like we did in 1986, which is eliminate all the loopholes that create this unlevel playing field and have a decent low tax rate, but don't have so many loopholes for the global corporations. So I guess I think that unfortunately people's feeling of tax burden is being manipulated to push through another set of tax policies that will only enrich the already rich.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We're talking to Chuck Collins, author of Born on Third Base, a one percenter makes a case for tackling inequality, bringing wealth home, and committing to the common good. Coming up, we're going to get perspective from Connecticut. We'll hear more from Chuck, and we'll take your calls and questions, 860-275-7266. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Everyone wants a chance at success, and some of us have advantages over others. Author Chuck Collins lays out in his book, Born on Third Base, that it's only better for our country when the wealthy in America pay more in taxes because they are then giving back to a society that helped them become prosperous. What do you think? You can join the conversation, 860-275-7266. Chuck Collins is with us from the studios of WGBH in Boston. Joining the conversation now is Jim Horan, CEO of the Connecticut Association for Human Services. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
We often hear about income inequality in this state, particularly when you look at the gap between the wealthy and the middle class and the poor in Connecticut. Give us an idea of the burden that's being felt here, Jim.
Yeah, Connecticut has some of the highest inequality in the country. Our income inequality is third among the 50 states. It's even worse for wealth. And Fairfield County is the most unequal of the top 100 metro areas in the country. The differences between Greenwich and Bridgeport are dramatic, but of course they're pretty dramatic between Hartford and the Farmington Valley or New Haven and the shoreline communities. And then when you look at race, we also have tremendous inequality, so it's a matter of place and race. For example, the poverty rate for whites in Connecticut is 8%. It's 21% for Latinos and 26% for African Americans. So we have very dramatic inequality in our state.
We also have a continuing budget crisis, as you know, as you're part of, again, the Connecticut Association for Human Services. Oftentimes we hear from lawmakers and residents in the state that, we can help decrease our deficit by increasing taxes on the wealthy. Then you hear from the other side, wealthy residents and some lawmakers, they're taxed enough, they'll leave Connecticut. Are we in a difficult predicament, Jim?
We are in a tough situation, but the solutions that Chuck is talking about, it's not a matter of pitting the wealthy against the poor. It's a matter of trying to figure out how we can work together to make things more fair and to create an atmosphere where we can have economic growth in the state that will benefit everyone. And I want to thank Chuck because he inspired a lot of the work that's happened in Connecticut to help make our tax system more equal. Over the years, I was part of a group that no longer exists, but it's called One Connecticut, where we worked, inspired by United for a Fair Economy, a group that Chuck founded and worked with, to help make Connecticut's income tax more progressive. And I think that was the right move, and now we have more income tax brackets, and that's a much better situation in our state. However, we're also at the point where we've had very little economic growth, very little job growth in our state, and we do have to figure out policy solutions that will work to create both economic growth and also reduce the inequality that exists in our state. And some of the moves that are being considered right now with the state budget crisis, big cuts to human services programs, to programs that serve low-income people, low-income cities, that's not the right move. And so we have to figure out solutions that are going to generate enough revenue to have adequate funding for essential services in our society, for our education system, while at the same time making sure that we can have an economic atmosphere that encourages businesses to grow and more jobs here for everyone.
I wanted to get Chuck Collins to weigh in on that. Jim mentions it's not about pitting the rich against the poor, but that's often the debate in this country. In your book, you talk about how we can't be antagonists, and that's not the way to get to a solution. So what are some ways, Chuck, to get to a place where people can come together on this?
Well, I think it starts with realizing that if you're a wealthy resident of Connecticut, it's entirely in your interest to have a state and have communities where people have adequate access to jobs and decent incomes, and that these extreme inequalities are really undermining them. There's all kinds of research that just shows it's bad for the health of local communities, and it's bad for rich people. So that's part of it, is to realize. And I like to say, look, it's time for the wealthy to come home and commit to place, because over the last 20, 30 years, we're seeing wealth moving rapidly around the world, capital moving offshore. Huge amounts of wealth is being hidden in offshore tax systems or in complicated trusts that mask who benefits, who owns the wealth. And so that's taking money out of the public sphere, out of the communities. And my message is, bring the wealth home. Bring it back to Connecticut. Invest it in local communities, in the local economy. Build a healthy regional food system, a local energy system. Revitalize our cities and communities. It is in our interest, everyone's interest, to do that.
Chuck,
so bring the wealth home.
I want to fit in a listener call. John's calling from Terryville. John, you're on the show.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to dispute some of the ideas there in terms of bringing capital home. The easy answer is you got to tax it less. If we're going to tax corporations at 35% in this country, and that's including when you factor in loopholes and deductions and whatnot, we have one of the highest corporate tax rates. So how are you going to bring capital home if we're taxing it at the highest rate? Capital goes where it gets the best return, and it's going to be taxed the least. So that's why corporations are going to Ireland and different places like that where they're taxed at 15%. So if you think this is just an easy well we can dip into with corporations, that's not accurate.
All right, John, thank you for your comment. Chuck, do you want to respond to our listener?
Yeah, I mean, we have a statutory corporate tax rate of 35%, but the effective rate, the rate that corporations actually pay, is closer to 19%, which is below the global average. And it's true. Ireland has created these tax breaks. A number of countries have created kind of loopholes that U.S. corporations are using to move their patents and subsidiaries overseas and play this kind of shell game to avoid taxes. What I would say to John is there is several hundred global corporations that are paying 0 or under 5% in terms of taxes. That is not that the reason they're leaving this country is because they don't want to pay any taxes anywhere. So the solution is to have global treaties with other countries that say, look, global corporations shouldn't be pitting countries against each other to pay 0, and that we should have a basic uniform. Corporations pay at least 10% income tax, and depending on what the kind of business they do, they should pay more. So there's a bit of misinformation there in what John is saying, which is, U.S. corporations have relatively low taxes globally. That's not the reason they're leaving. They're leaving because they want to game it down to 0, and that to me is irresponsible, because U.S.-based businesses that are rooted in Connecticut, are paying their fair share of taxes. So the answer is not to allow more global loopholes.
We're almost out of time, but I wanted to just talk to you more about some of the policies, not just tax reform, but policies to help the people in that bottom half of the country, to be able to put a little aside to save, to have that safety net. What can, individual states do?
A number of states are doing interesting things to look at how do you help people save, creating matching savings programs. The whole issue of college debt and how can people, a number of states are looking at creating debt-free college education funds. Washington State taxes inheritances, above $5 million and puts it into a fund that provides debt-free college education for Washington State residents. So there are things that can raise the floor, just as we did after World War II. A whole generation of people were able to buy their houses with, 40-year 1% fixed-rate mortgages. If you go around Connecticut and talk to farmers and baby boomers, they all took advantage of the post-World War II wealth-building opportunity programs. We can do the same thing again, and states can innovate in that space.
We should stress, and I know you do in your book, after World War II, African Americans didn't get the same fair shake.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the lessons is, look, you shouldn't design a wealth building opportunity program and then racially exclude. We put millions of white families on the express train to wealth building, and we left blacks and Latinos out. So we need to remedy that. We need to repair that. And why wouldn't we create a first-time homebuyer program for people who've been excluded, of any race, been excluded from the opportunity to buy a house? Why do we push them into the predatory lending markets?
Well, I do want to thank Chuck Collins, who will be in Connecticut this weekend for the second annual booming Winsted Book Festival. We're going to have more information on our website, WNPR.org/wherewelive. Again, Chuck Collins, senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies, author of several books. The one we were talking about today, Born on Third Base, a one percenter makes the case for tackling inequality, bringing wealth home, and committing to the common good. He joined us today from the studios of WGBH in Boston. Chuck, thank you so much for your time. And just real quick, how many of these one percenters have come home for you?
That more and more are coming home every day. And there's whole organizations like the Patriotic Millionaires and Resource Generation. There's networks of people who are bringing the wealth home, through impact investing, philanthropy, and speaking out for fair taxes.
Again, thank you so much to Chuck Collins, who joined us today from the studios of WGBH in Boston. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Thanks so much, Lucy.
Also want to thank Jim Horan, CEO of the Connecticut Association for Human Services. Jim, thanks so much for your time as well.
Thanks very much, Lucy.
Coming up, looking for something new to do this weekend? You could drive to the northwest corner of Connecticut, to the town of Norfolk, a place that has fostered a musical tradition for 76 years. We're going to tell you more after the break. This is Where We Live. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel.
There's a bedroom called the Sibelius bedroom, and I looked at the mattress the other day, and I'm pretty sure it's the same mattress he slept on.
Norfolk is a lovely place to visit any time of year, but during the summer, the town's home to the Yale Summer School of Music and the Norfolk Chamber Music Festival in its 76th year. Where We Live took a road trip to the northwest corner of the state to visit the campus where it all takes place, the former estate of Ellen Battelle. Her family instilled in her a love of music, a sentiment she and her husband fostered in starting a yearly music festival back in 1899. And they built a one-of-a-kind concert hall called the Music Shed. It's here where we met up with director of the Norfolk Chamber Music Festival, Melvin Chen.
When Ellen Battelle Steckel passed away, she left in her will that the grounds of the estate and the buildings would be in the hands of a trust that maintains, the buildings and the grounds, and she left money for that. But luckily for us, she also left money for a summer program in music and the arts. And so we're here, thanks to her generosity. And I believe this is the 76th year that Yale has run a summer program on the estate, and so Yale has a long history with music, obviously back in New Haven, but there's also a very long history musically of Yale in Norfolk.
Can you tell us more about Ellen Battelle and her husband Carl Steckel and why this was so important to them?
Well, as I learned from Jim Nelson, who's been the general manager at the festival for many years, it's great in my first year because every day I'm learning something new, and it's literally true, actually. But Carl Steckel's father was Gustav Steckel, who was the first music professor at Yale. So the family has a long interest in history with music. Carl Steckel made his money in the shipping industry, and so he was and grew very wealthy and was able to build this enormous mansion on the estate called the White House, which is quite an amazing piece of architecture. But they had concerts on the estate. They used to have a kind of 3-day festival in the summer. And it was not a chamber music festival in those days, and it was actually a kind of orchestral festival. And And Ellen Battelle would have a express train from New York, and the musicians would get on this train. It would come right to Norfolk, and they'd play orchestra concerts for 3 days. There were enormous crowds at these things back in the day, and so that's where all these famous soloists performed. As a matter of fact, for example, Vaughan Williams premiered one of his symphonies here. And Sibelius stayed in the White House for a month and wrote a piece, that was commissioned by the Battelle family.
This year, the Yale Summer School of Music accepted 72 students from the U.S. and 11 countries, including as far away as Australia. The students live with host families in the town of Norfolk. I asked Chen to explain how the students, the faculty, and guest artists collaborate for the annual festival.
There are many aspects to the musical life at Norfolk and the Chamber Music Festival specifically. One part is just the public concerts, which you see, which involve guest artists and faculty. And so we'll have many faculty from the Yale School of Music, but also the great performing artists of this generation, including the Moreau Quartet and the Emerson Quartet, playing on this stage and also teaching. And so that's the other side of the Chamber Music Festival, is that we are basically a school as well in the summer. And we're a school specifically focused on classical chamber music, which is music for small ensembles, anywhere from duos up to 7 or 8 musicians. And our aim is to educate the next generation of professional chamber musicians. So we scour the country for the most talented instrumentalists. They're usually undergraduates or in graduate school. Some of them invariably come from Yale, but also from the most distinguished conservatories around the country, including Curtis, Juilliard, New England Conservatory, Colburn Conservatory in California. So we have a great mix this year of very talented people. Not all from the U.S. We have a brass quintet from Australia. But what they have in common is that they're extremely talented, and we feel like they show great promise towards a professional career. So every week they're performing by themselves, usually on Thursday evenings and Saturday mornings, but also every Friday night we feature some of the fellows, as we call them, playing alongside their faculty mentors.
This will actually be tonight that we hear this?
Yes, tonight is a Friday evening concert on what we call the main stage series, and it's the beginning of our Dvorak mini festival, which is a 3-week series of concerts devoted to the music and influences of Dvorak. And so tonight you'll hear a program entitled Dvorak and Brahms, which looks at the relationship between the two composers. Brahms was a mentor to Dvorak and helped him in his work and his career for many years. And so we juxtapose the music of Brahms alongside the music of Dvorak. And the kind of centerpiece of the program is this great F minor trio by Dvorak, one of his best and biggest pieces, and also a piece that shows great influence from Brahms. And you'll hear one of our student fellows, Peter, playing the cello alongside 2 faculty artists.
You're also a musician, and I understand it's your first year as director of the festival. Tell us about your background.
Well, I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee.
So you're a Southerner.
I'm a Southerner. And I studied violin and piano at a young age, and then I went after high school to Yale and got a science degree, actually, and then I went to Juilliard and got a music degree. And then I went back to school and got another science degree, but then I decided that music was what I really wanted to be doing.
What does it mean for you to be the director this year?
Well, as I describe it to people, I think I was equally excited and terrified. I mean, it's very exciting to kind of be the head of a place that has such great history, such great tradition, such great quality. But at the same time, it's also a great responsibility to carry that forward and to grow it, so it remains relevant to today's time. So it's equally it's challenging and thrilling.
You mentioned you learned violin and piano at a young age, but then you went on and pursued a science degree. but you eventually ended up in music again.
Right.
Why?
Well, I like to tell people that Asian parents like their children to learn music, but they don't want them to become musicians. So my parents started me on these instruments, and my parents were both scientists, so I think naturally I got a science degree, but I love music and I love playing it and teaching it, so I gravitated towards that eventually, and my parents are okay with it now that I can somewhat support myself.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We're in Northwest Connecticut in the town of Norfolk, where each summer musicians, both students and professionals, have joined in the celebration of chamber music in collaboration with Yale Summer School of Music. We met up with director Melvin Chen, who's in his first year leading the 76th Norfolk Chamber Music Festival. I asked Chen what advice he gives the music students who are selected for the prestigious program.
I mean, they're immensely talented. I think every generation of musician that comes, I remember when I was a student, my teachers were saying how great the students of my generation were, and now I'm saying the same thing about the next generation. I mean, I think that that the students now face interesting opportunities. I think that everyone has heard about how classical music is dying, and I don't subscribe to that theory. I think that every generation has to make what they do relevant in a new way. So what worked 50 years ago is not going to work today. I think underpinning that has to be a great study, work on the craft and artistry of what they're doing, of playing their instrument, of working together, of making great music. But at the same time, they have to also think about, why is what we're doing important to other people who don't play music? And so I think this generation is facing that, as I think every generation has faced it, and I'm confident that they'll come up with their own creative solutions that nobody will think of.
With that in mind, how do you connect what you're doing here to the community of Norfolk? Again, it has a legacy of following music and the tradition here, but also to communities outside Norfolk. How do you bring people here in the summer for this festival?
Right. I think that is something we're always wrestling with. I will say that the town of Norfolk is an incredibly supportive body towards the Chamber Music Festival. I see the same people over and over multiple times a week, coming to the student concerts, coming to the master classes, coming to the Friday and Saturday evening concerts. I see them on the estate, enjoying the scenery. I see them talking to the students. So, I think the town of Norfolk has always been incredibly supportive. I think, one of the challenges will be, because Norfolk, I feel that this festival, and I think the town of Norfolk also feels that the festival is such a gem and a jewel, how to let other people who may not be so close find out about it. And I think, we're trying a number of different ways to do that. One of the things that was started several years ago is that we stream all our concerts online, so people, the parents of the Australian brass quintet can tune in, probably at an ungodly hour for them, but they can watch their children, perform on the music shed stage. People who are supporters who can't make it to a concert for whatever reason can get on their computer and watch a great, quality video stream and audio stream. I think the other thing is to make Norfolk, the Chamber Music Festival, a destination in some way. So if someone in California is thinking, oh, there's a great festival on Dvorak. I love Dvorak. Why don't we plan our vacation? Why don't we fly out from California and check out this Dvorak festival? So in terms of the programming, making it compelling enough that people will want to make a special trip to see it. Not simply because, oh, I'm in the area, I have nothing to do on Friday night, why don't I come to the concert? But instead because they're so intrigued by what we're doing here in terms of not only the quality of the performances, but the kind of intellectual breadth of the performances, that they will come because they're curious and interested.
You mentioned that you're from Tennessee originally. You have an Asian background. What are some ways that you can attract more diversity in the audience who comes here each year?
Yes, I think, again, that's another one of our challenges. I think there are a couple ways to do this. I think, if anyone who comes to our emerging artist concerts, they'll see that we make the students say something about the piece beforehand. And, we encourage them, not only to talk about the piece, but to talk about their personal connection with the music. And I think that, for someone who hasn't been to many classical concerts, it's hard for them to kind of find an initial relationship to the music. And I think, seeing a student talk about their own connection to the music helps them in that way. I think the other thing is, and this may be counterintuitive, is that, we have to make it clear that when we play chamber music, we're not just playing the music of dead composers, but that music is actually alive, it's still growing. And so part of that is also featuring in some way the music of young people who are writing now, people who, haven't been dead for 50 years, to see that there's still new music being written, still good music being written, still interesting music being written.
You also mentioned just perceptions of classical music and in general, and I was looking through some of the programs, and in the program it makes a point to say this is not a formal festival. You can come and be comfortable. I think that was an interesting distinction to be made, so people know that it's open to everyone. Yeah,
I mean, our tagline for Norfolk is music among friends, and I think that's the way we like to think of it, that the students, the faculty, the audience is kind of one big family, and and no one should feel uncomfortable at any of these events. And so I welcome anyone who's never been to a concert to come and check it out. And I think they'll find that kind of the surroundings, how beautiful it is outside the concert hall, how beautiful the music is, will immediately make them feel comfortable.
That's Melvin Chen, director of the Norfolk Chamber Music Festival in its 76th year. Tonight's concert will feature music by Dvorak and Brahms, performed at the one-of-a-kind Music Shed. Details on our website, wnpr.org/where we live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Our show's produced by Lydia Brown and Jeff Tyson. Our technical producer is Kyone Wolf. WNPR's executive producer is Katie Tolarski. Thanks for listening, and have a great weekend.